Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Welcome back. I'm your host, Paul Barter. A change of pace this month. I was the interviewee recently on the OoruLabs Talking Heads podcast, which is an Indian podcast and YouTube channel hosted by Sathya, Sankaran and Knerav, Kodolikar. They've given me permission to use some highlights from the interview for this month's Reinventing Parking. OoruLabs is a weekly show with a focus on urban sustainability in India, and especially the city of Bengaluru, formerly known as Bangalore. The topic was parking reform for the Indian context, which means that the issues are relevant for many middle-income and lower-income cities all over the world, where private motor vehicle ownership is surging, but for now is still relatively low. In that situation, parking policy choices can potentially be pivotal, and parking choices will likely play a big part in choosing the urban mobility destiny for each city. In this episode, we talked about how parking policy can start going wrong as vehicle numbers rise. Why is it so important that cities manage their on-street parking? The idea of car dependence, and how I got interested in parking issues 15 years or so ago. What difference can civil society make to improve parking trends? Changing parking mindsets, but also take action. Parking mindsets change in the process of acting on parking reform. And finally, we can get the prices right without harming the poor sections of society. Thanks again to Sathya and Knerav at OoruLabs. Here is 25 minutes of edited highlights from the interview, which was OoruLabs episode 16, The Problem with Parking.
Let's go. Welcome to another episode of the OoruLabs podcast from Bengaluru. Ever complain how bad our cities are, how bad your commute is? You'll get to hear from people who are working to solve these problems in their own way. This is your weekly soapbox for urban sustainability. I am Sathya Sankaran with Knerav Kodolikar. And today on the show, we'll be speaking with Dr. Paul Barter. And I remember reaching out to him in 2010. And so for the past 14 years, he's been doing a lot of work around parking. He talks about parking to many people across the globe on his podcast and blog. It's called Reinventing Parking. We'll talk a little bit about that. Welcome to the show, Dr. Paul.
Thank you, Sathya, and hello, Knerav, and hello, listeners and viewers.
One of the first things I want to start with is, why is parking really a problem? What are we doing wrong with parking?
So I guess people in India sometimes feel as though the huge problems that you see in your cities are somehow unique and new, but parking has been emerging as a problem in city after city all over the world for about 100 years now. And we can very clearly see more or less the same story happens over and over and over again. If you think back maybe 20 or 30 years in Indian cities, car ownership and even two-wheeler ownership were quite low. And so it wasn't really a problem if the few motorists would park their car or their motorcycle more or less anywhere. But fairly quickly, as economic success comes along, and we've seen that in India, more and more motorcycles, more and more cars, motorists face competition from each other for those parking spaces, and they start to get frustrated. They also start to cause problems for others. The parking gets in the way of people on foot, people on bicycles, people in cars and motorcycles trying to move, and buses get clogged up and impeded by the parking. And the problem is the mindset that emerges in those early days doesn't go away. Each new generation of motorists assumes that the natural order of things is that I should be able to park wherever I please, more or less, and it should be free if I can possibly organize that. And so the initial impulse of governments is to react to that rather loud set of yelling and screaming from the motorists as they start to perceive this problem. city governments, state governments are very reluctant to do the obvious thing, which would be to ration the parking through various methods. But the most effective is using fees, on-street parking fees, enforcement to make sure people don't park in haphazard ways that are a nuisance. The easy thing seems to be, let's build more parking. So cities in the city centres will often try to find some land and build some parking. There's also a mindset that city-owned land is free land somehow, which is not true. Land always has an opportunity cost, and land is very, very precious in city centres, busy areas. But somehow this idea of the free land, so we can use that for parking. And the idea that building owners and builders, people who build buildings, developers, should be required to provide parking on site within the compound. So country after country, city after city adopts that policy of requiring plentiful parking within each compound. And it's a seductive idea, and that's where things go wrong. Making off-street parking does not magically suck the cars and the motorcycles off the streets. So what typically happens is you end up with a situation where the busy areas have some off-street parking. Typically, you have to pay for that parking, whereas the on-street very often is still free of charge, or it's very, very inefficiently priced. Maybe you have some kind of pricing, but it might be attendants taking a bit of cash, but that pricing is so inefficient and the price is much lower than the off-street parking. And so you still have chaos in the streets, and you still have half-empty parking off the street. That means that the off-street parking is not making money, because even though it's trying to charge money, it's underused, and the land and the building of that parking turns out to be incredibly expensive, especially in busy parts of cities where land and building is expensive. What's the root cause of this problem? The one key mistake was to fail to manage that on-street parking vigorously. And in the past, it was quite difficult to do that, but it turns out that it's getting easier and easier. The technology has improved, and we have more and more examples of places that have solved this problem. So there's really no excuse anymore. Indian cities are lucky that they've got lots of examples to look at now to do the right thing, and that the number one right thing is to manage the on-street parking, perhaps.
The question that I want to ask is, why do we have to manage this on-street parking? What is the goal of managing parking? Why can't it be, I heard you say one of these things, it's not a public good. So if you talk about private passenger vehicle parking, why do we have to manage parking, especially on-street parking? What is the goal of that? Why are we trying to even do this thing?
The simple reason is to make sure that motorists have an incentive to look for off-street parking and to be willing to pay for off-street parking. If the on-street parking is not well managed, then the motorists have almost no incentive to even look for off-street parking, let alone to pay for off-street parking, let alone to pay the full cost of the off-street parking, or this full opportunity cost. The secondary reason is on the other side of the coin. Where is the parking off-street coming from? Somebody has to invest to make sure there's off-street parking. So the early days, or the simplistic solution, was for the cities to build it and subsidize it. It was loss-making. They thought they had to do that, or to force developers to do that. So we'll talk more about the parking reform movement, and the parking reform movement is informed by the experience of several places around the world, as well as lots of research. And the idea is that if motorists have the right incentive to look for off-street parking and to pay for it, then developers and builders and the owners of buildings, the real estate industry essentially, will have also the right incentive to meet that demand. If they see a demand from motorists for parking that motorists are willing to pay for, then the real estate industry can respond to that, right? Broadly speaking, the experience in certain places, such as downtowns, city centers all over the world, is one sort of arena where we see this working reasonably well. But also Japanese cities are an example where, if you ask a parking reformer for their list of, say, 4 or 5 things to reform, Japan does not do exactly that list. But the things they do are close enough that we can point to Japan as being an interesting model. And a reassuring model. It reassures us that cities don't need to worry so much that there'll be a shortage of off-street parking. And to some extent, they followed the same story as everyone else, but they did one or two things that were a little special, which changed their scenario. One of the early responses to the problems of parking in residential areas in the busier parts of cities was to ban on-street parking overnight. In most countries and most cities where they did that, they gave up after a little while. As car ownership went up and people were saying, well, what choice do I have? I have to park somewhere. I have to park in the street. So, don't be so cruel to me. So the governments eventually gave up on that. In Japan, they stuck to that. They persisted with this overnight parking ban. But the second interesting thing Japanese cities did was Japanese law exempted small buildings from the parking norms. They only kick in for medium-sized buildings, and even then they're quite low, and they phase in. So it's only when you have a really quite large building of about 6,000 square meters of floor space that the full parking requirements, parking mandates, or parking norms apply. So what this meant is that actually lots and lots of small developments and medium-sized apartment buildings weren't required to have very much parking. And so at the same time, there's almost no on-street parking. So very, very quickly, in almost every neighborhood in Japan, there was a market demand for off-street parking. And gradually, the private sector started to charge for their off-street parking. Buildings that had some off-street parking would very often open it to the public and say, okay, you can come in, but you have to pay. People who owned small plots of land, if they weren't ready to build on it, they would let it be parking temporarily. So if you go to Japan, there's priced parking, off-street parking, almost everywhere, typically in very small facilities. And not much of that parking is government built or government owned. So we can be perhaps reassured that parking can take care of itself if we manage the on-street parking.
Or taking a slight detour and speaking to your personal role in academia, as someone interested in urban transportation, I was wondering what personally got you interested in looking at parking with the reform and parking as an issue to tackle.
My background was in environmental studies, and then I did a PhD in public policy, essentially, but focused on connection between transport and the built environment. And the cities that I looked at were in Eastern Asia. So for your audience in India, if you visited Australia or the United States, you probably were struck by how empty those places seem. Most Australian cities, most North American cities are very, very low density. So if we think of Bengaluru, the number of people per urban hectare is above 150, approaching 200 people per urban hectare within the land that is already built on. Well, it has some kind of urban land use. In American cities, typically it's about 1/10 of that, something like 15 or 20 people per urban hectare. If you want to have 90% of your people moving around by car, you have no choice but to spread out in very, very low densities. You can't reverse this easily. And so the team I was working with was concerned about this concept of car dependence. My PhD wasn't focused on parking at all. But fast forward another 7 or 8 years, and I read Donald Shoup and read Todd Lipman and realized for the first time that parking was a really important fundamental part of that story. I was inspired by those guys to see that maybe we can do a lot about it and make a big difference with parking. Car dependence is this really big kind of ocean liner with a huge momentum in the wrong direction. And places like Australia and the US have been in this ocean liner for a long time. And so they're very, very far off into the ocean of car dependence. Places like Indian cities are embarking in that direction slowly. And there are people at the rudder fighting with each other. Some of them saying, no, let's build more metros and improve the buses and manage the parking. And others are pulling at the rudder and saying, no, let's build expressways. Don't put bus lanes in. Don't manage the parking, build more parking for me. I need more parking. Spread the cities out to avoid congestion. They're just trying to accommodate the traffic and the cars. They have a short-term vision. But the thing is, if you spend year after year, decade after decade of accommodating traffic and building parking, keeping it cheap, building roads, keeping the roads cheap, you'll be in that ocean of car dependence before too long. The recent Reinventing Parking episode was about Beijing. And we talked about how 10 years ago, the parking situation in Beijing was worse than Indian cities. The streets were just clogged with parked cars and parked motorcycles just everywhere. So in just over 10 years or so, the big cities, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Shanghai, Beijing, have really got a grip on their parking situation and improved things a lot. And so there's some good examples to follow. And we can see signs in India of a really good debate about parking. So lots of people saying the right things about parking and lots of argument and debate. People are fighting about it, and it's not easy. But I'm hopeful that Indian cities will see the parking reform light soon, and more of them will experiment with parking reform and demonstrate to the other Indian cities that, look, it works. You too can achieve these benefits.
So some reforms are coming, like you said, but they are few and far between, and they're still struggling to cater to this vocal audience that you said, that are car users, which is assigned to prosperity and the stuff that we are a growing economy now. We need to cater to a lot of motor vehicles. Considering that, what kind of role does civil society movements play in, on the one hand, calling out parking reforms, what it may be, and on the other hand, trying to push sustainable transport modes like public transport and other things? What role do you see for civil society, and how do you think that will, what kind of examples have you seen around the world that you can hold for us?
Just briefly, perhaps I'll touch on a negative, but we'll quickly switch to the positive. But unfortunately, some consumer advocacy organizations sometimes champion free parking and opposition to parking fees out of perhaps good intentions, and because they have had some success in other arenas where they found some predatory practice. Unfortunately, when you apply that to parking, it's a rather mistaken focus. But by all means, the parking fee system should be made much more efficient. We should get rid of the predatory kind of parking mafia organizations. But being just against parking fees is a really poor use of precious civic advocacy effort. So let me perhaps mention some Indian organizations and people who are pushing in the right direction. So over the years, CSE, the Centre for Science and Environment in Delhi, and Anumita Roy Chowdhury has been a champion of parking reform. Shreya Gadapelli, who I think you interviewed, is a long-standing champion, and her group Urban Works. Her former organization, ITTP India, is still working on parking reform. And these are all excellent resources and people that you can turn to learn more about parking reform within India. And there's a new organization in the US called the Parking Reform Network that I'm part of. And we're hoping to become an international network, in fact. And we'd love to have members or correspondents in India who are part of the network and can help information to flow both ways. What's happening in India, the rest of the world can be inspired. If an Indian city or town does some good things on parking, everyone else can learn from that. And similarly, non-profits and other activists and advocates on various policies, when they need to deal with parking, it can be very confusing. It's a bit technical sometimes and just confusing because the obvious thing to do is not always the right thing to do. We in the Parking Reform Network and other parking reformers can help you to get your head around what would parking look like as part of an agenda that will help your cause.
What you think the decision makers in India should be doing? I mean, if you had to summarize for them, do this, follow this, do this, or do that, it would be useful, because there are parking policies coming in and they are all leaning towards paid parking, but not necessarily going all the way. And they don't have to go all the way right up front. But what could be the sequence that you think they should go after? That would be nice to hear.
One of the things that Shreya Gadapelli says is perhaps the first thing is to change our mindset about parking. So you remember I said that harmful mindset that emerges early on is a privileged mindset. I deserve parking and it should be cheap and free. It's like a public good that just should be there for me. A much better mindset about parking would be to say parking is real estate. It's like hotel rooms, meeting rooms, right? We don't need the government to require these things. We don't need the government to subsidize these things. If there's a demand for them, private sector will generally speaking build them. But because there's this interaction with the off-street parking, which is real estate, the on-street parking, which is not quite real estate, right? Part of the public realm. So government has responsibility for the on-street parking. And the on-street parking is, again, a mindset. Instead of treating it as just a free public good, treat it as a common property resource. The classic example of a common property resource is a river. Okay, so if you have factories along that river and people fishing and extracting that river water for irrigation, it's all too easy if we don't ration those activities for that river to be used and abused and end up in terrible, terrible condition, which is not good for anybody. The same with parking in the streets. To the extent that we allow it, parking is a common property resource that will inevitably be overused in busy areas, at least. And in India, you have no shortage of busy areas, right? So parking will almost inevitably be overused on an Indian street with motorcycles, small lorries, big lorries, cars, all of them, a whole menagerie of vehicles will be occupying that parking. So just like a river, you need to ration that use. And with rivers, the rationing takes many forms, right? Often it's rules, regulations. It's complicated. Pricing is only one of the part of the toolbox. But when it comes to parking, it turns out fees are the number one effective, efficient, tried and tested, hundreds of cities all over the world. It works. We know it works. And it's almost like magic. A few years ago, I came up with a hands-on user experience game using cards on a sort of a pretend little piece of a city with squares that represent parking spaces and buildings and things. And so both ITDP India and UrbanWorks have adapted that game for the Indian case, and they've improved it and made it much more fun. And that game illustrates the power of on-street parking fees to magically almost, because when people play this game, they don't expect it to work quite so well. It gives people an incentive to use the off-street parking and to find the off-street parking. Okay, so it really, really does work. Rationing on-street parking, it really, really does work. Where was I? Mindsets, right? So what Indian authorities need to do, off-street parking is real estate. On-street parking is a common property resource like rivers. But unlike rivers, the number one tool for rationing is fees together with enforcement, effective enforcement. There is a problem that the traffic police are the ones responsible for enforcement. And not to be critical of them, they're doing the best they can, but they've got bigger things on their agenda, right? If you have chaotic parking in a relatively minor street, the traffic police will go and look at that and say, my priority is making sure the traffic flows on the big roads. But cities should care about chaotic parking, even on the minor streets, not just the major streets. Cities probably need to negotiate with the police to delegate some of their power for parking enforcement to parking wardens who will see it as their number one priority to enforce the parking rules, even on the minor streets, because it's still causing other problems. You're then failing to give the motorists that incentive that they need to look for off-street priced parking. What we see around the world is that once cities start to do the right policies of pricing the on-street parking and refraining from promoting the off-street parking, the mindsets also change. Don't wait for the mindsets to change before we do something.
That's a tough sell for you. We have to be able to visualize that and show people how it's going to look. And like you said, the mindset is the biggest thing today. Everybody needs to be told one simple truth. Parking needs to be rationed and it's no longer going to be free.
By the way, you mentioned the worry that pricing the on-street parking would be a burden to
some sections,
certain sections of society. So just let me make 2 points about that. One of them is that in today's India, if we think of parking as kind of like rent for a certain number of square meters, an off-street parking space for a car, roughly speaking, 25 to 30 square meters once you take account of the aisles and the ramps and all of that. On-street parking, about half of that, because you don't need the aisles and the ramps. For a two-wheeler, a motorized two-wheeler, off-street is much, much less than 1/10 of the space for the cars, because the aisles can be narrow. What's the traditional price for parking a two-wheeler? It's just half the price of a four-wheeler, right? So if you calculate that as a fee per square meter, who is overpaying? It's the two-wheeler users. So they are subsidizing their richer four-wheeler users currently, right now. So as part of parking reform and having proper pricing, don't raise the two-wheeler prices. They may already be about right. Sometimes they might even be too high. But the four-wheeler prices probably need to rise in the busy places. And that's the second point. So I said I would make 2 points. So the second point is you only raise the prices where you need to. What we want to make is to make sure the on-street parking is not totally clogged up and chaotic, but we don't need to overdo it, right? There's no point pricing on-street parking so pricey that there's no cars in the street at all. If the road design is such that there's enough space for parking and it's still safe and you can still have, traffic and buses and etc., then by all means have parking. But ration it. You get the right price so that you have parking, but not full parking. I know that the cities in India that have been most progressive in thinking about doing the right thing with parking, Chennai, Bangalore, Bengaluru, Pune, and a few others, Ahmedabad, they've been struggling with this question. What's the right price? Well, there is no answer to that. It's a trial and error thing. You wait and see. You should sort of make a guess, one price for cars and then maybe 1/10 of that price for motorcycles. And then you just wait and see what happens. If the parking is still full, then you'll need to raise the price a bit more. And if it's still full, raise it a bit more until you get a few vacancies. You might find that you need a morning price, a midday price, and an afternoon price, or an evening price. You might need 4 prices because the parking might be totally empty in the morning, but it's really chock-a-block full in the late afternoon. And that will give some incentive to some people to change when they park, not just where they park. The power of these fees is almost magical.
Thank you very much, Paul, for coming on the show and demystifying this whole thing, telling us about your journey and why parking is so important. I'm going to have a couple of more conversations with people around this and see how it's going to lead to better utilization of road space and help clean it up.
You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.